it's the intersection of the land itself and the stories we tell about the land. And that definitely seeped into me from a young age. And it did inform my worldview. And I think of witchcraft as a worldview as well as a practice. So even though I wasn't perhaps intentionally practicing witchcraft as like a 6, 7, 8-year-old, it was this lens still through which I was sort of viewing the world. I think there is a danger in sharing the totality of your personal experience because you're desperate for an answer and you're desperate for somebody to say, oh, it's this, and then you attach to that. It becomes your sort of life raft, I think, in this sea of confusion. My brain was like, this is what you wanted. Like, this is the experience you wanted to have. You're getting the validation that you needed. You're 100% awake. You're not asleep still. Stay awake. This is amazing. Then there was this part of me that was absolutely terrified. Just like viscerally shitting myself. And immediately this thing looked at me, and I couldn't see anything besides a shadow, but immediately it turned its attention on me. Suddenly the fear was like dampened.
Welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, and the world of the spirits, and everything in between. For episode 64, we are joined by occultist, poet, and writer Celeste Mott. Born in England and raised in Australia, Celeste has made New Orleans her home. She was gifted her first tarot deck in the 90s, and at age 13 she began seriously studying the cards, along with every book about spiritualism, magic, and the occult she could get her hands on. Her personal studies and practices led her to earn a BA in Philosophy and Comparative Religion, with a special focus on new religions, movements, and magic and ritual in contemporary religiosity. In the context of Celeste's nomadic past, we discuss identity and place, the importance of discernment with the occult groups you reach out to and engage with online. Celeste shares with us a formative spirit experience with what would become a familiar spirit. We also discuss recent events where Celeste was dealing with a particularly unpleasant spirit attack, where a spirit had formed an attachment to her. Now, we recorded this show against the backdrop of a very large thunderstorm, and at the 104 minute mark, the storm gods decided it was time to intercede and cut my Wi-Fi. So this is the natural segmentation point where we move from the regular show to the plus show. In the further 30 minutes of the plus show, where Celeste and I nobly battle on against the face of overwhelming natural odds to delight and inspire you further. We discuss TikTok's prevalence for humanizing spirit or deities. We talk about poetry as an expression of one magical process. And we wrap up talking about living in a hurricane alley and the healing qualities of practicing gardening and how we communicate with the spirit of plants. Now, if you want to hear the Plus show, then sign up to the Patreon and you'll get my Plus show along with a host of other benefits. You can also buy me a coffee via the usual means. Now, while I'm on this topic of the Patreon, I'd like to give a big shout out and thank you to Jennifer White, who has been a patron supporter for some time now. Thank you, Jen. Really appreciate it. Now, as always, I'm always interested in people's experiences with the other, from hauntings to shadow people to Jinn, the other people. So if you've got a story to tell, then reach out to me. You can use the voicemail link in the podcast show notes, or reach out to me on Twitter or Insta. I'd love to hear from you. To those of you who have given me a rating, a 5-star rating on Apple or whatever podcast client you're on, I'd like to say thank you. I've already noticed some people doing it and I really appreciate it. So I'll ask once again, if you feel inclined to do so, a positive rating really helps Apple and the other podcast clients push the show up the rankings and get more attention. So it'd be greatly appreciated if you could do so. Right, let's get into it. Celeste Mott, you're very welcome to the Spirit Box.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, to get things started, it would be great if you could just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I am, I struggle to answer that question sometimes because I feel like I'm in this sort of constant state of self-discovery and evolution, but for the sake of podcast audience, I am a writer and a poet and a practicing occultist, in which my sort of full-time job is being an occultist, I guess, primarily doing readings. That's sort of my main hustle, so to speak. But I also do mentorship for folks, and I write and I create quote unquote content. I know that's like a controversial term that some people don't like, but make a lot of online content in that sort of witchy occult sphere. And yeah, I like grew up in the UK. So you're in the UK, right? Not like you're in England rather than Ireland.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I grew up in England, and then I moved to Australia when I was 10. And I spent 15 years or so in Australia, and then I moved to the States about 9 years ago. So I live in New Orleans right now, in a very sort of witchy city. It's a good place to be a professional occultist. It works, you know.
Sure, yeah, that must be one of the best locations on earth to be a professional occultist.
Yeah, certainly the industry is booming here, shall we say.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's a huge gamut of areas to have covered. Really, does that give you a sense of like feeling quite like a global citizen? And what does that mean? Like does New Orleans feel very much like home? You know, where did that kind of, where does it set you?
It's interesting. I mean, I think in a way it does give you a perspective, having lived, you know, for a solid amount of time in a bunch of different places. But at the same time, I mean, you know, I don't want to paint all Western cultures with the same brush, but there's not, you know, a huge cultural variety maybe between England and Australia. Certainly are quite similar, because Australia was massively colonized by the British, so similar vibe there. Just hotter, more desert-like, more things that can kill you, of the insect variety. But yeah, I mean, there are definitely distinct cultural differences. Though I would say the jump from Australia to America was a huge cultural jump, actually, more perhaps than I had expected. There is definitely massive cultural difference.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Particularly living in the South of the US vs Australia. Yeah, so but it's been good. It's been good. And I don't know. I mean, New Orleans definitely feels like home. I think you can tell somewhere feels like home when you start being annoyed by it. So, you know, the gloss wore off after about the first year of living here. This city does things to people. It's a very intoxicating city, and it definitely, if it wants you, it wants you. You get a lot of people who visit, you know, once or twice, and they go home and they're like, oh my God, you know, I've left part of my soul in New Orleans and I have to be there, and I'm being driven. It's almost like this sort of lover's frenzy of I'm being driven crazy by not being in New Orleans. There's sort of a bit of local mythology that Marie Laveau sort of put a spell on the water in the city, and if you drink the water in the city, then you are doomed to forever pine for it. Very romantic stuff. But once you actually live here, after a little while, you know, that glamour peels away a little bit. I mean, I still love it here. It's I like to think that it will always be a place that I return to, even if I wind up moving away for a while. But it is a difficult city. It's a strange place. There's a lot of challenges to living here. A lot of pain rooted in the land. So it's the strangest place I've ever lived, certainly.
Right. So that's interesting, and I can see that. I do get the sense of like being a kind of an interloper, a tourist, or whatever, versus living is, they're two very, very different things. You know, like people say that stuff about Ireland. They're like, Ireland's so beautiful, it's wild, you know, all that kind of stuff, and it's all that. And it's like, it is, but you know, trust me, kind of mid-November, you take anywhere else with like had more daylight, more hours of daylight would be appreciated.
Right.
You know, and
you know, the governmental things, I'm sure, and social structure things.
don't even get me started. You know, but I think, you know, okay, I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole too much because I'll be off. We're kind of, but it's like the weather in a place affects the culture, hugely. It's like Ireland's kind of famous for for writing, for music and that kind of stuff. Basically, stuff you do indoors.
Right.
Alcoholism, we're quite famous for that because we're indoors drinking.
Same here. Same here.
So it's that kind of thing. But anyway, I digress. Let's get it back on track. What I wanted to really ask you about, particularly kind of through because like even though you said the cultures are broadly similar, still quite a global hop. It's like it's quite significant in terms of like the landscapes that you've been in, the kind of the history of the areas you've been in. And what I'm really intrigued in is into your journey into magic, into becoming kind of a practicing cultist, practicing witch. Where did that start? And do you carry some of the influences from the places you've lived with you? I mean, witchcraft is for a lot of people rooted in the land. It's rooted in the kind of the local plants area, and does that all come with you?
Yeah, I think definitely. It's another, common question, obviously, that I get asked, but still one that I struggle to answer, which is this question of like origin, and it sounds sort of cheesy, but in some way, I think I was always, always practicing witchcraft, quote unquote. I was definitely, I grew up in the rural UK, so I grew up in the Cotswolds.
Right. Okay.
Right. Very fancy. Green Welly territory, as my mom calls it. Pearls and Wellington boots and horse riding. But, very like village life. I think people who haven't perhaps been to the United Kingdom, I think sometimes struggle to conceptualize what that looked like in the 80s and 90s. Maybe it's different now. I don't know. But, I went to a tiny little village school. There was a lot of wandering through fields and, poking inside tree hollows looking for fairies. Like that was absolutely my childhood. And even though neither of my parents were that way spiritually inclined, the storytelling around the landscape and the landmarks in the area of the UK that I grew up in, and there was always a story about there's this particular crossroads near where I used to live in the UK. It's sort of like a four-way crossroad, and it's known as Betty's Grave. And there was this sort of just big local mythology about what Betty's Grave was. It's like a little street sign even. It points to, you've got the directions to the nearby towns, and then you have just this little sign that someone's made that says Betty's Grave. It's been there for 100 years. No one knows who put it up. And the story there is, was Betty a witch who was driven out of town and burned at the crossroads? Is Betty this spurned lover? There's one version of the story where Betty was incredibly good at cutting corn way faster than all the local men. And so she just cut all this corn incredibly fast. And then the men got really mad about it. And, I'm ranting now about this local mythology, but to me, it's the intersection of the land itself and the stories we tell about the land. And that definitely seeped into me from a young age. And it did inform my worldview. And I think of witchcraft as a worldview as well as a practice. So even though I wasn't perhaps intentionally practicing witchcraft as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, it was this lens still through which I was sort of viewing the world. And then I didn't really get into it as a field of study probably until I was in my very early teens. It's that I was part of that 90s witchcraft boom, that coincided with The Craft being released and all of that. I graduated high school in 2003, so I'm right in that first witchcraft boom that I think we're now seeing a second version of. And so that's when I started sort of looking into it more deliberately. A lot of things were very resonant for me. But at that point in time, I was in suburban Australia, which is about as different as the Cotswolds as you can get. It's very, very different. All strip malls and desert and beach, a lot of beach. And I have to say, I never really felt a connection with the land in Australia. I still don't. Like, if it's the place I've lived the longest, but if you had to, gun to my head, where's home, it would be England or New Orleans. And Australia, I just don't. I just don't feel that same resonance. There is a very potent spirit on that land. I mean, incredible, indigenous cultures that have a very direct and present relationship with the land in Australia. I think I could be wrong about this, but I think from what I recall, Indigenous Australians are some of the sort of oldest surviving Indigenous cultures that practice in the same way as they did millions of years ago. So, I mean, that's very present on that land, but for me, it never felt like a deep and resonant connection in the way that it did in the UK, which is interesting. I don't know why that is.
No, I get why that can be, because sometimes it doesn't really actually matter how long you stay somewhere. You can still be just passing through.
Mm-hmm.
I've cities that I lived in twice for like 10 years combined, and I still don't have that connection. Like in Irish, they often use the word love for it. They say like I don't have a graw for the place, and it's like you don't have a love, you don't have a connection for it. And I've a lot more like graw for Delhi than I do for some UK cities I lived in.
Yeah.
So I can see how that can happen. And in terms of, like you mentioned, as a teen, you started kind of your study and practicing. I guess that was in suburban Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, um, how did that manifest? Was that kind of like a very like a bookish exploration, or were there any kind of experiences that triggered that? I mean, I know you mentioned that you had that experience of as Jenny's grave. Was that right?
Betty's grave.
Betty's grave.
Yeah,
Betty's
yeah.
grave. So you had that kind of experience that kind of gave you that mythology of land, of
Mm-hmm.
like, and putting all those kind of stories together, and kind of that place being special, being different,
Mm-hmm.
that identified itself as being different. When did kind of, what I guess what I'm looking for is the trigger point into
Mm-hmm.
Magick. I get that you're like, that's always been there for me.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a turnkey experience at some stage where you're like, okay, this is different, and I don't feel like I'm playing anymore, or something's kind of
Yeah.
drawn me more into this.
Yeah, I think so. The main thing I remember about being sort of a younger teen, because it was a lot of it was books. There was this interest there, this intellectual interest, and I vividly remember sort of being in my middle school library, and I went to a religious school, so you can imagine how this went over. But trying to check out like every book that I could in the middle school library about witchcraft, and the librarian sort of being like, "What are you doing? Like this is not the way." I'm surprised they had any books on witchcraft, to be honest with you, but there you go. And so that was like there was a fascination, but it always felt like trying to grasp at something uh, that I knew that there was an experiential component, but I didn't feel like I had accessed it yet. And so it was this sort of voracious desire to learn in the hopes that it would somehow engender an experience, and I think that went on for, a couple of years. I have always been a lucid dreamer. That's something that I've always been able to do. And so there was that part of the experience of magic that was sort of going on in the background, but I was having trouble, I think, like connecting the dots on what all of this meant and trying to put it into a personal cosmology that made sense. And it probably wasn't until, later high school that I did start to have experiences that were like, something's going on here that's not perhaps what everybody is experiencing. And it is a bit odd and left of center. And a lot of it took place in that sort of hypnagogic state where I was, and so then because we were kind of chatting about it a little bit before we got on the call, but you go through that phase where you're like, well, there are logical explanations for this. So, maybe it's just that I'm super overtired, or, didn't get enough sleep last night, or mental health things are going on. And so I had a few years of that. And a lot of those experiences are things that I've now come to understand as spirit experiences, on one level or another. But making peace with that and categorizing them in that way is new for me. Like, I would say I waited around in the liminal space of doubt and the fear of delusion for a good 15 years, being like, I don't know what that was. Very new for me to feel confident in saying, oh no, it was this. Okay, good. And also, I think, the internet was such a big part of me learning and discovering the occult community and occultism generally. And as you know, and probably a lot of the people listening to this know, but maybe not so much the Gen Z folk, the internet of the early 90s was the fucking Wild West, totally different situation.
It was properly chaotic. Yeah.
It was indeed properly chaotic. And so I came across this group of people on the internet when I was sort of, I don't know, 16, 17, 18, who became very formative for my understanding of the world at that time. But it was on this sort of anonymous message board. No one obviously used their real names at that point in time. YouTube wasn't even a thing yet, there was no video or personal element almost. It was just sort of layers of smoke screen. And these people, as much as they were teaching me about things about magic and all of these other things that became very formative in my practice, they also took a lot of my experiences that I was telling them about, the dreams that I was having and the spirit experiences, and they grafted on top of that their own narrative of what was going on. And it became this very sort of cult-like environment, honestly, that it really derailed my practice for a good 10 years. It was very strange. That's a long and rambling answer to your question.
That's a great answer. Yeah. I think your point about kind of being derailed is really important. Really important. It's as much as we talk about kind of these the formative spiritual experiences, exactly as you're saying, where you kind of rationalize stuff, the mental gymnastics that I've done to rationalize that spirits are contacting me, on the reg, that
Right.
you really kind of look for anything to help you with that. But then when you actually make that step to reach out to kind of an occult community of some description, fundamentally you're in a vulnerable state. You're kind of a noob in there, and you can be easily kind of led astray and led down rabbit holes and whatnot. So it is an important point to make. I think people far more articulate than I and certainly kind of more experienced in the cult community have said these things. It's be careful of the communities you join, because not everyone has great intentions. Just because people are quote unquote occultists and are experienced in spiritual matters doesn't mean they've got any kind of moral integrity.
Totally. And I think even pardon me, even if they do have good intentions, it's easy in that vulnerable place of desperation to just allow yourself to get sort of co-opted accidentally, even if people are not intending to manipulate you. I think there is a danger in sharing the totality of your personal experience because you're desperate for an answer and you're desperate for somebody to say, oh, it's this, and then you attach to that. It becomes your sort of life raft, I think, in this sea of confusion. And so I think it's a fine line between finding communities that you can trust to give you feedback and perhaps help you navigate those very confusing waters, vs becoming entirely dependent one person or one content creator or one guru or one group of people to tell you like what's going on. It's something that I tell my my Patreon folk, my mentees a lot. You know, I'm here absolutely to help you puzzle out whatever it is that you have going on, but don't just listen to me. Like, I don't know everything by a long fucking shot. So, you know, read widely, talk to people that you trust, talk to many different people, find your own way through that. And I think sometimes people are frustrated by that, honestly, because they want just the one person to say it's this. But
Yeah.
I don't think that's how it works.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You know, and I think that, but I also think you like that's sage advice. You know, that you outline that you have to get different perspectives on things. It's important. You know, as equally with one's study and one's reading, it's like be kind of get a wide berth of influences and to draw from. You know,
Yeah,
it's important.
absolutely. And I think, you know, even if you read widely and you come across a lot of things that you heartily disagree with, at least then you've seen what's out there. You know, I was talking to a mentee, a friend of mine, just last night actually. She's sort of earlier on in her journey and feeling very overwhelmed because I think particularly in this day and age, there's just a alarming amount of information out there. You know, you Google witchcraft occult and, you know, it's not like it was even 10, 20 years ago, right? There's just so much out there, so much material available. And she was saying, you know, well, I don't even know how to start. Like, where do I get started? What do I do? And I said to her, again, fine line, it's a balancing act, but maybe start inside, figure out what you're actually looking for. Why are you doing this? What are you drawn to before you go out and throw yourself in the deep end and hear these like 3,000 different opinions on whether or not you should curse somebody or whether tarot is a closed practice or whatever else is going on out there right now. Tune into yourself and figure out what your experience is, what your motivation is, what's calling you. I don't know. It's a tough one because I also think, you know, we can't just rely on personal gnosis. Otherwise, we're going to wind up driving ourselves crazy, probably.
Yeah, I think it is. There's no answer. It's just pieces of the puzzle. You know, and I think one thing I certainly that I've found of late is that, you know, our sense of time, our sense of linear time, and you get these like kind of little kind of like peaks and troughs of communication or experience or kind of indeed personal gnosis that happen over, as you just said, like, you know, 15 to 20 years worth of practice. So much of that only makes sense retrospectively. And that, like, the search and the search for meaning, the search for kind of a truth is kind of part of it. And I think that's where people get a lot of through time. They get a lot of sense of meaning that eventually comes. You start to see context that comes with experience. That's certainly been my experience. And the way you're describing kind of yours, it sounds like it was similar for you.
Oh no, I completely agree. And I think, again, sometimes when people are very, very early on down the path, that can be frustrating to hear. I mean, I was frustrated by it when I first started. I remember a big part of my first sort of push into this world when I was more sort of seriously studying things. I have journals from that time where I'm just like, I just want to know what it means. Like, this big sort of panic. And there have been things that even just this year, from, you know, things that happened in 2003, 2004, that only this year have the pieces come together. And I've been like, oh, holy cow, you know, like that's what that was. Very, very strange, but also very beautiful. And I mean, I think that's why I do this, because I enjoy the threads coming and going. And to some degree, I enjoy the puzzle and the riddle of it all. I'm less frustrated by it, I think, than I used to be. Sometimes, anyway. Sometimes still frustrated.
So in terms of like that first experience that did shift you from kind of, okay, that was weird, but it might have been, you've forgotten the word for it. You know, when you were kind of you were asleep, but you're sleep
Oh yeah,
paralysis, sleep paralysis. Yeah,
the
yeah,
hypnagogia, yeah.
yeah. That it might have been sleep paralysis. That's what you were experiencing, something strange, or you know, that auditory sensation I was
Hmm.
getting. Maybe I've got some sort of tinnitus
Right,
to
right,
you know. So we've gone through all those kind of, yeah, no, must be anything but that. You know,
right.
what was that kind of quintessential thing that you know, I call them like the apocalypse moments where everything just shatters, you know, and you see the world from a totally different angle.
Yeah, it's sort of like probably a little cluster of experiences that happened all around the same time. But the one thing that happened that I think, to this day, I just don't have a good rational explanation for. And so that is certainly like a flashpoint. And I wrote about it recently, and there's this wonderful journal that's been created called the Feminine Macabre, created by Spook Eats. Spook Eats is great. And I had a piece published in that a couple of months ago, and it goes into this experience. But I must have been probably about 18 or 19, maybe a little bit older. And I lived in this apartment by myself. And I had cats. I've always had cats. But the cats were not allowed to sleep in the bedroom with me because they were insane and kept me up all night being crazy. So I always shut my bedroom door, always made sure the cats weren't in there. And I'd been having a series of weird experiences for like a couple of years at that point, but nothing so undeniable that I was like, oh crap, like this is something serious. Always just in that strange space where you can doubt yourself and say, well, this or that might be happening, tinnitus,
Mhm.
etc. Um, and so, the things that had been happening leading up to this experience included, like, I got very sick, and doctors couldn't seem to like tell me what exactly was going on. I sort of, my physical appearance changed, which sounds like a weird thing to say, but you can look at my school pictures from like 2001 to 2002, and I go from being this very sort of tan, um, olive skinned person to like white as a sheet, look like an entirely different human being. Very weird. So all these things were happening in the background, and I was trying to figure out what it meant. And then I had this experience in my apartment where the cats were locked out. I'd gone to sleep, and I had been sort of like, I guess, praying in a sense for some kind of event to happen that would show me that something was seriously going on. Because I was at this point like a couple of years into this roller coaster, and honestly pretty depressed by the fact that I was just not getting answers and that I felt like I was going crazy. And so I woke up in the middle of the night. I like rolled over in bed or whatever, wriggling down under the sheets, and my foot connected with something heavy. It was like, like a cat was sleeping on the bed or something. And that's initially what I thought it was. So I'm like, wriggling, poking with my foot, trying to figure out what the shape is. And there's that moment where my brain is waking up and taking over, and I'm like, well, hang on, it can't be a cat because I shut them out of the room. No one else lives here. No one let them in. And then I'm kind of tapping, and I realize that it's also too big to be a cat. And I managed to open my eyes, and I'm squinting in the darkness at the end of my bed. And there's just a full scale, like, adult human being sitting on the end of my bed. And it was the weirdest thing because in my brain was like, this is what you wanted. Like, this is the experience you wanted to have. You're getting the validation that you needed. You're 100% awake. You're not asleep still. Stay awake. This is amazing. Then there was this part of me that was absolutely terrified, just like viscerally shitting myself. And immediately this thing looked at me, and I couldn't see anything besides a shadow, but immediately it turned its attention on me. Suddenly the fear was like dampened. And I still knew it was in there. I still knew I was like very afraid. It was almost like I couldn't access the fear. It was like I had been administered some kind of anesthetic. So I'm looking at this thing, brain's telling me to stay awake and this is a good thing. Body is in a state of fear, but I can't fully access it. And it starts moving up the bed toward me. And I just remember thinking, you have to stay awake. This is very important. This is an experience you need to remember. And then this thing did something, and my eyes were like, "Oh no, we're gonna close now. Your entire body is shutting down. You have to go back to sleep." And I fell back asleep. And in the morning, I woke up, and my bedside light was on, which it had not been when I went to sleep. The door to the bedroom was closed. The cats were not in there. And I absolutely just don't have a logical explanation for that. There isn't one, aside from, I guess, you could say sleep paralysis, but I don't get sleep paralysis typically. I remember thinking, well, no, I'm totally awake. I'm not asleep right now. And there were these physical elements that went along with it. For a long time after that, I would wake up with bruises on my body, that in very strange places that I could not possibly have bruised myself. All sorts of weird shenanigans around that time.
It's completely intriguing. Do you remember any details of the figure? Like, did it have clothes on, or colors of clothes, or anything like that?
It was so dark that really it just looked like a shadow. It was definitely masculine. It wasn't, it wasn't genderless. Mm-hmm. It wasn't female. The energy was, sort of masculine. And I had been working at the time with something that I now recognize as a familiar spirit. I didn't recognize it as that at the time. I was in a very strange place with all of that stuff, trying to figure out what it all meant. And I had this group of people on the internet telling me that it was, a totally different thing. But now I recognize it as a familiar spirit. And I think that's what this thing was. In retrospect, I mean, that's what I was trying to contact. It's what I was calling out to, and that's what I think was going on in that particular instance. But at the time, I didn't know what it was. There were a bunch of things that happened in that house. There was another time that I rolled over in the middle of the night, woke up, and there was just this sort of 7 foot tall, like, person shaped, almost like someone had punched a person shape into the air, like just sort of like an absence, but filled with light. And I was just looking at this silhouette radiating white light. I looked at it for a while and basically just decided, no, I'm not dealing with that right now. I'm going back to sleep. I don't know what this is, but I'm not here for it. So, some weird things happened, but that shadow figure was definitely, it was a moment for sure.
No, I can imagine. It sounds like it sounds like a pretty intense experience.
Yeah.
No, I love the way that you're like, I'm not dealing with that.
Oh God. Yeah. I mean, there was just so much bonkers stuff happening around that time that it did get to the point where I was sometimes just like, I just need to sleep. Like, no, not today.
That's hilarious. I had a one of the kind of the bit that we were chatting about before we started recording about the kind of the strange kind of apparition that I saw in my flat. It was like the lights fully on, and then this kind of like about 2.5, 3 foot kind of like cloud just floated through my room with like little kind of like bluey sparks in it. And my reaction was, because I was reading and I just kind of looked up and saw this thing. And kind of, tracked it as it moved across my room. And I literally just went like this. I just closed my eyes, opened one, and it was still there. And basically kind of, I went from like, what the fuck? What? To just, all that happened in my head was, I just went, and then kind of it went. But yeah, that was kind of when I was like, okay, right, this something going on in this flat.
Right. This is not normal.
Yeah, that was it. I was like, I cannot rationalize that. There is nothing I've got nothing for it because I'm not experiencing anything else. This is just this kind of stuff at night in this place. This stuff is happening on the reg. But yeah, I think your reaction was far more, I think, mature than mine.
I was just, And the crazy thing about that, like this light being, whatever it was, I mean, I think I told a few people about it at the time, and some people were like, maybe it was an angel. And I was like, I fucking hope not. Honestly, everything I've read about angels, no thank you.
Yeah.
Anything but that. Aliens, I'll take aliens over an angel, God. But I was at a party maybe like a year after that, and I still lived in the same neighborhood, We're at this party, it's like 4 a.m, and everyone's high as fuck, honestly. Winding down after a night at the goth club. And she got talking to this person I'd never met before, and she was like, oh, where do you live? And I was like, oh, around in the apartment complex. I live in the apartment complex around the corner. And she had lived in that same kind of neighborhood, not the same apartment complex, but in that part of town. And we were talking about paranormal experiences, and I relayed this story of the light person. And she was like, shut up. And I was like, why? What are you talking about? And she was like, my sister and I, when we were little kids, lived on that same street that you lived on. And one night at like 3 o'clock in the morning, we both woke up and we saw that exact thing that you're describing.
Wow.
On that same street, not in the same building, but yeah, it was very weird. And I mean, I don't know who this person was. I don't even remember her name. I don't think we were friends. Maybe she was just, went a little bit too hard at the goth club and was just like making a story up. But it was very weird. Very weird moment.
Yeah, that's yeah. Well, it's another line that kind of comes in to the story and gives you that kind of like positive result, right? And they are kind of like, what the fuck? But, they have impact. They really do. Those things they're world shattering.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like the validation of hearing somebody else say, oh, I had this very similar experience, like I think that is important. When I said earlier that shadow being, whatever it was, at the end of my bed, and that becoming such a reality shattering moment for me, I carried that around with me for, I don't know, like 15 years, not knowing really what it was, being pretty sure it was something, but still having a small doubt in the back of my mind that maybe I was just a crazy person. I mean, I could be a crazy person. That's both can be true, right? But I had so much grief, honestly, about that moment, because it was one of the experiences that got really co-opted by this group of people on the internet. And when all of that fell apart in like 2009, 2010, I put it in a little mental box in the back of my head, and I said, okay, well, we're just going to put that in the didn't happen delusion box and move on with our life. And then earlier this year, I had a reading with a very good friend of mine, Sasha Ravitch. At the time, we weren't good friends. We were just kind of community members. She's an extremely talented astrologer, an astromagician. She was just doing a normal chart reading for me, to talk about my life generally and other things. At the very end of the reading, she stopped and she said, this is super weird. I don't usually do this. I hope you don't think I'm a crazy person, but you have a spirit with you, and I'm seeing it really strongly. And we were not, I can't stress enough, like we probably knew each other about as well as you and I know each other. We had like a couple of conversations, but we were not close. She didn't know any of my history. And she described perfectly this spirit that I had been sort of interacting with since I was a kid, like right down to like buzzwords that she was using that would have been ways that I had described this being.
Yeah. Well, so you've got a couple of on the target.
Dude, I burst into tears, honestly, because I had for such a long time, it was such a huge part of who I was, how I viewed my practice, how I viewed my path. So important to me on multiple levels, including this really emotional level. And I I'd had to put it down and put it away and tell myself that it wasn't real. And then this person who did not know me was like, here's this thing, and it's right there, and it's like with you, and it's always been with you, and it never left, it never went anywhere. And it was blew my mind, honestly.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow. I'd like to ask if you're comfortable. Do you want to talk about recent events?
Oh yeah, let's talk about
Yeah.
recent events.
So, did it come from the Este method stuff you guys were doing? Or not
You
the
know,
Este, I don't know. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Estes. I don't know.
Estes, yeah.
That's a good question, and I don't know. That's been speculated because essentially earlier this year, I've had a very odd year. Like a lot of things kicked up for me in sort of January, February. But for a while, as you said, I was doing a lot of Estes method stuff with this group of friends. And I also, I'm also friends with Marco Visconti and in Marco's Patreon. And there was also a pretty big and intense Estes method session that happened as part of Marco's Patreon. So I was messing around with that for a while. And we were definitely getting some pretty intense results, I would say. I mean, I love that method of spirit communication because it is so similar to sort of induced trance, I would say. And I think when you get a good, clear connection, the results can be pretty mind-blowing. So things were definitely coming through during those sessions. We were pretty careful. Everybody in the group that I was involved in, I mean, certainly with Marco's stuff, but also with the group of people I was working with in New Orleans, we're all magicians, right? We're all occultists. So we were cleansing beforehand and kind of setting our parameters and boundaries, being very clear about what was allowed to come through and what wasn't. But I would argue that you can't ever completely control what's going to come through. Yeah. And so I don't know. It's very possible that the Estes sessions that we were doing were what stirred up the attention of whatever this thing was that paid attention to me. But as you said, I guess we're going to dive into discussing it. But so Dara and I was supposed to record like a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
And I had to message you the early morning of that recording for me and say, like, I can't do anything. Like, I'm so sick that I don't think I can make it through a conversation. And at that point, I was in the midst of what I now understand to have been a really gnarly spirit attack. And I mean, I feel crazy. I'm going to use that word again. I'm sorry. It's very not politically correct, but also as someone who has had mental health issues, I feel like I can reclaim crazy. But I still feel weird saying that out loud. I think even in the realm of people who practice magic and who are occultists, when you say like spirit attack, it carries with it a certain ambience that a lot of people like, I don't know. But that's what it was. I mean, I can't explain it any other way. And I was in a lot of denial about it for about a month. I was getting all these indications in dreams, and clients and friends of mine were dreaming about me and saying, I'm having these weird dreams that you need to protect yourself. Getting these indications through divinations and synchronicities. And I'm sometimes an idiot. So I was basically just like, probably doesn't mean anything. It's fine. Never mind. And so I didn't pay attention until weirdly, I think the tipping point was on the last full moon. So I guess about a month ago, I finally sort of decided, well, I've had enough indications that I should do some protection magic, that maybe I will. Maybe I'll just throw that out there. So I went out to my little outside altar space. I've got this greenhouse where I grow plants in. I have a little altar out there. And I do quite a bit of candle magic out there. It's usually not a problem. I lit this protection candle on the full moon. And I went about my business, and I don't know, about 2 hours after I lit it, I was like, I'm going to go check. I don't usually go check on my candles, but I think I should just go see what's going on. And it had burned almost all the way down. There was no wax left, but it was in the ceramic candle holder, still burning. And the flame was like very large. And I'm looking at this kind of out of control, burned down candle flame, thinking to myself, well, I don't like to extinguish candles when I'm doing a working prematurely, but this looks like it's kind of getting a bit crazy. Maybe I should
Yeah.
do something to it. And, you know, stupidly, because again, I'm sometimes not very bright, I blew on it, which is a great idea with an open flame. Let's just add some fuel to it. And it, you know, flared up. And at that point, I was like, I'm going to have to put this out. Like, I'm going to have to put this candle out. This is really, you know, it's about to catch plants on fire. This is wild. And so I had some water in my hand that I was about to make an offering with, and I poured the water on it, and the flame shot up about 3 feet into the air.
Wow.
Went out. A crap load of like gnarly black smoke filled the greenhouse. And this is a small candle. It's like a small taper candle, right? This should not have happened. And the candle holder snapped, like broke in half, like shattered. And I was like, okay, so something's going on, I guess. And at that point, I had a couple of people that I trust who, again, don't know each other, didn't know the situation. I had them do some divination on it. And both people separately basically said to me, yeah, you know, there's something on you, and it's not coming from another magician. It's not, you know, no one in the community is throwing work at you in this instance. But this is like a spirit has taken a shine to you essentially and wants to work with you, but you should definitely not work with it because it feeds on suffering, and it feeds on, you know, it will give you things and it will offer you things, but it's also going to take a lot in the process. And still, you know, after hearing this from two separate sources, there was still a big part of me that was like, well, I don't know, you know, maybe. Forever, you know, in my Agent Scully mindset. But I was fostering these kittens at the time for the Louisiana SPCA, and a couple of days after these readings happened, while I was in the sort of in the process of gathering the things I needed to get rid of this entity, but not really I wasn't very committed to the gathering, if that makes sense. I was like, well, you know, I'll pick some things up, and I guess I'll do some protection work, but ho hum. And then one of the kittens that I was fostering very, very suddenly died. And it was very traumatic, honestly. It was, you know, like it died while I was holding it, while I was trying to feed it antibiotics. It was very, very upsetting. And when that happened, I was like, okay, you know, runt kittens die. That's a thing that happens. But this is weird. The timing of this is weird. The whole feeling of this stuff that's going on is strange. And again, did some divination about it, and the divination turned up that yes, probably the spirit had a hand in this creature being taken, and also that the spirit was very happy to continue killing things, so long as I, you know, remained ambivalent to getting rid of it. So I was like, okay, well, now we're doing it. And anyway, long rambling story to say, as soon as I got serious about getting rid of this thing, and started really putting my mind to the work that I was going to do to get rid of it, that's the morning that I woke up, morning before this ritual that I had planned, and the morning that you and I were going to record. I woke up in the most physical pain that I've ever been in my life. It was absolutely horrifying. I have, you know, I have a chronic illness, so I'm pretty accustomed to being in physical pain. It's not unusual, but this was like 5 a.m. stabbing pain in my stomach, and I was in absolutely crippling pain for about 4 or 5 hours. Then it started to abate. I was, you know, in and out of, like, I was oscillating between the bathtub and the bathroom and my altar room where I was praying, quite frankly, for this to go away. And I thought I was going to have to go to a hospital. I was like, you know, this is bad. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if my gallbladder is exploding or what, but like, this is just 11 out of 10 physical pain. And I remember talking to a friend of mine and saying, I really think that this is spirit related, and I think it's trying to weaken me so I can't do what I need to do tomorrow. I think
Mm.
it's trying to, because I could not have done anything that day. I couldn't have talked to you. I could barely stand. Like, if I had to do the ritual that day, we would have been fucked, because there was just no way. And I managed to make it through that day. I really think, again, I sound very woo-woo, but I really think in large part because I was petitioning some of the other spirits I work with to help me through it, and praying and making offerings, and I managed to wrest back some physical strength, and then I did what I needed to do to get rid of this thing. But it's one of the scariest experiences I've ever had. 10 out of 10. Horrifying. Do not recommend.
Oh Christ! I mean, I agree. I think I would definitely, quote unquote, shit myself.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of that too.
Sounds fucking horrific. I'm first off, I really value you talking about this. I really value you sharing this with people, because it's very important. I think you keep dropping these big lessons for people, which I think is really valuable. Because it's magic is it ain't all like scented scented candles, and I got some fun herbs I'm going to burn, right? And then and then something fun's going to happen. Like, there's fucking things that can go seriously wrong. There's a lot of casualties out there of people who sort of fucking around with something, or something that kind of they wasn't for their pay grade, or something took a shine to them, like you've just experienced. And it's hard to dig. It can be hard to dig yourself out of it. So like, first off, I'm really glad to hear that things have gotten better, and that you were able to kind of rally things and get them right. So it's 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 important for people to recognize that these things can go
Yeah,
sideways.
I mean, I think we don't maybe hear that side of things as much as we should, and also as much as it goes on. I think that this happens much more frequently than we hear about. And I know, like, there's a big push right now, I guess, online to not like fear monger, and there's all these conversations about don't fear, particularly amongst newer practitioners. And I get that. I get that we don't want to like front load this like horror show to young people. And I'm definitely not here to scare anybody, but at the same time, if you, and this was my moment of eating humble pie a little bit. If you're gonna believe in the good stuff, like the abundance magic and the prosperity magic, and all these wonderful things that you can pull to yourself and your life can improve, then it does stand to reason that there might be other things at play that are not so fun and light and squishy. And I had this sort of, I mean, straight up, whatever it was, like 10 days ago, when I was maybe 24 hours out of this, like I'd done what I needed to do, and I was in the recovery process, which I'm sure will honestly it'll be a long recovery. I think, like, psychologically, I'm still grappling with it. But I was ready to take all my occult books and throw them in the Mississippi River and be like, I'm done. You're not going to do this anymore. Because this was nothing that I deliberately called to me. It wasn't a case of me getting cocky and, intentionally buying into something above my pay grade. It really did seem like it just happened to me. And if that can happen, and I think it does happen, I don't think that I'm special in that regard. I think that sometimes these things just happen. We need to tell people that you got to prepare for that, I don't know.
I think that's eminently sensible, and I can see how people think that kind of forewarning that some elements of this can be challenging and somewhat dangerous to some degree. But some people might see that being tied up as like, well, that's just feeding things like the satanic panic, right? Like, where it's kind of like Daily Mail headline. You know, but it's still important for us to kind of help keep people inside the rails, you know, so they can be a little bit more prepared for things, you know, should they go sideways. Like,
yeah, and that's it. I think it's just,
Hmm.
you know, it is just preparation. Something that was told to me throughout this process is, you know, everybody's going to look at that kind of thing with a different lens, you know, and there were definitely people who said to me, I didn't talk about it to a whole lot of people, but there were people who were like, oh, do you think that that was a demon, you know, or whatever. And the people that I trust, who I spoke to about it, said, you know, like this thing, whatever it was, wasn't, you know, evil. It wasn't, you know,
Mm-hmm.
there's just a lot of things out there that aren't human, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
have a human conception of morality or, you know, right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, this thing, much like a, you know, much like a tiger, right, this thing was just acting in accordance with its nature, and its nature was, well, i want to I want to connect with or work with Celeste. There are things that I can offer her, but there are also things that I'm going to take from her, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
exchange, that's the deal. And when I started to hit back, it got pissed off, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think that I think there's a fine line between having practical and pragmatic conversations about this kind of thing that do prepare people, hopefully, for the eventuality that this may occur. VS feeding into that satanic panic version of the story that's like,
Yeah.
oh no, there are evil forces and they're trying to
Yeah.
get you, and you know, it's
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah. Absolutely. You know, I mean, because it is like, you know, we talked at the start of the show about kind of the impact of kind of living in a Western culture. That probably there's some differences, but the kind of the main road is pretty much not like for like, but it's sitting in a familiar territory. Within that is an Abrahamic context. Within that is a Christian context, which is
Right.
monotheistic,
Right.
which is like anything outside of this is demonic. Anything.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter what it is, you know? So that's still at the back of a lot of people's minds. So when you engage in this kind of space and you're going like, yeah, look, this is a grant, but you need to be careful of this. You know, that's just mindful mentoring and guidance, as opposed to kind of like setting kind of the hairs running. But you know, you're right. Has to be that kind of mindfulness again, second mindfulness around the context of the culture that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought you made a really, again, a really important reflection of like non-human intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and one of our failings as human beings is we project our values and our morality and our way of thinking and conceptualizing onto the entities that we're engaging with.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Which I think is natural to a degree. I mean, I think you can't entirely escape that, even if you're being very well intentioned.
Yeah.
That's just how we are, right? It's the lens. But yeah, you know, you see it a lot in I see it a lot anyway, you know, whenever I'm scrolling TikTok. God forbid we invoke TikTok. But you know, people who are working with deities and who are projecting these sort of like fanfic type personas onto like Hades or Aphrodite, and it's like, you know, it's interesting. I don't want to judge it, actually, because I think like this is just, it is maybe just a different perspective on which some of these people are.
What I was going to say is I want to properly chat to you post podcast. Sorry, listeners.
Yeah.
So is there anything that you want to say to people in terms of what you're coming up, your practice, where they can find you?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm around the internet in various places, mostly Instagram. That's my main place where I rant. And so I'm at Celeste Mott, Mott, on the gram. If you prefer spicy takes and ridiculous jokes, I'm also on Twitter. And I'm at Who Dreamed It on Twitter, just to make life difficult. And then my website has all my other sort of social media handles. So that's celestemott.com. And I do readings. I have a Patreon. If you're into being part of the Discord community on Patreon, we all have. So I've got a lovely group of people, honestly. Like, they're just lovely folk. Come and hang out with us. We all are nice, mostly, and have a good time. And yeah, as far as what I've got coming up, I really don't know. I'm mostly just probably gardening and being a very boring sober person is what I have coming up.
That sounds awesome.
Right? But yeah, thank you for having me. This was a total blast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. We managed to get
We
through
made it through.
lightning storms, power failures. Not bad.
I know. We did
Um,
it.
that's been an absolute pleasure to have you in the Spirit Box. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll have you again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Darren.
Thank you, Celeste. Some really interesting food for thought there. I thought Celeste's insights were really, really astute. There's a lot I think we can learn from her point of view and her experience. To that end, Celeste has a Patreon. The links to which are in the show notes. So do follow her, because I think she's got a lot to teach and is very forthcoming and very knowledgeable. So I'm going to leave it there. And thanks for listening. And thank you, and talk soon. Bye.